What's good, guys? AxelBeats here for AnimeUproar, and Luffy's newest form, Gear 5th, as well as all of the crazy new information about his Devil Fruit, have definitely shaken up our understanding of what our bouncy boy is capable of. So today we're going to be taking a look back at his fruit and everything that it's been able to do so far in the story. We're going to talk about every form, a couple of attacks from each, how and why Luffy would make use of these forms, and if any of the new information that we've recently received changes our perspective or understanding on any of these things. So, there's about 25 years of rubbery innovation to take a look at, so let's get into it. Before we do though, if you're enjoying the One Piece content on this channel, be sure to leave a like and a comment with a suggestion on a video you might want to see in the future. Speaking of the future, you should definitely subscribe to the channel and hit that bell because we have a ton of great content in the works. Ringing that bell is the best way to stay notified for our uploads, and it's a totally free way to support the channel. But with all of the YouTube stuff out of the way, let's talk about Luffy, spoilers and all. If you've been keeping up with the manga, you know that the Gomu Gomu no Mi is not what we expected. It isn't simply a paramecia fruit that turns the user's body into rubber, but it's in fact a mythical zone fruit that the world government has been searching for 800 years. It is actually the human fruit model Nika. Nika, of course, being the sun god that brings smiles to the world and fought for freedom for all. We've seen a few other human fruits in the past, and in both cases, they have been fairly unique. For example, Chopper's human fruit is the only fruit in the series that we know of that has no effect on a normal human being. But it also can be augmented by the Rumble Ball to not just have 3 forms like other typical zones, but 7. Something which Luffy was very interested in originally, and ironically has become something that he's met himself, as Luffy has shown 7 major forms. His base form, Gear 2nd, Gear 3rd, Gear 4th Bound Man, Gear 4th Tank Man, Gear 4th Snake Man, and the new Gear 5th. Interestingly enough, the other human fruit that we've seen in the series is another mythical variant, this being Sengoku's Buddha model, which in itself is a pretty unique parallel to Nika, each of these being pseudo-religious leaders, and while the Buddha might not be a god himself, he is someone who is reincarnated as the Dalai Lama, similar to how Nika, Joy Boy, and Luffy are connected. So, while people might think the situation with Luffy is a little bit strange, there's at least some sort of precedent for it specifically with human devil fruits. The Hito no Mi model Nika is described by the Gorosei to give its user a rubbery body and to bring smiles to the world around them by becoming the embodiment of the warrior of liberation, the sun god Nika. However, once the fruit awakens, it drastically evolves. In its base form, as I mentioned, Luffy was given a rubbery body and lost his ability to swim, common to all devil fruits. A rubber body allows him to stretch his arms, legs, neck, or really any part of his body, ladies, and slingshotting, bouncing, or rebounding them at enhanced speeds. But it also offers other properties associated with rubber. It makes him immune to electricity. Physical attacks like bullets or punches will bounce off of him unless they are infused with hockey, and he can even be inflated like a balloon. And while it took him some time, through stretching or contorting his own body, he learned to be able to unleash some pretty devastating attacks. However, there is a theme with the fruit in general, and it seems to be more about ingenuity than just springy boy go boing. Luffy's most iconic attack in his normal form is the human pistol. This seems like a good time to say that I'm not calling it that. We're gonna stick with the normal names that we've known for 2.5 decades because something about human just sounds weirdly gross to me for some reason. So on that note, let's talk about some gum attacks, most of which are named after guns or artillery. I would talk about all of them, but the wiki lists 90 of them for just first gear, and we'd be here for literal hours. So instead, since this video is already going to be pretty long, I'm just going to cover a couple of the major ones, a few of the goofy ones, or just ones that I think are very fun. So as I was saying, the Gum Gum pistol is probably Luffy's most iconic attack. He pulls his arm back and slings it forward to crash into his opponent with some pretty strong force. But if he really needs to send someone flying, he will use both arms as opposed to just one, in essentially the same motion, crashing into his opponents after slinging them back with Gum Gum Bazooka. If Luffy needs some mobility, he has access to Gum Gum Rocket, where he can extend his arms, grab hold of something, and use it to slingshot himself at high speeds. Gum Gum Gatling is more like a barrage of punches, with Luffy moving his fists so fast that it looks like he has multiple fists flying at his opponent. This can be a finisher for when Luffy really wants to beat someone down, or doesn't want to send them flying, or just needs to deal with a big group of enemies. Gum Gum Rifle is kind of an upgraded pistol. While he stretches his arm back, he starts coiling it and twisting it around, and as he releases it, the extra force from the torsion crashes into the opponent for a much more focused and damaging hit. And the last of the major attacks that come up fairly often is Gum Gum Whip. This is a, as you might imagine, whip-like attack where Luffy uses one of his legs to hit a big group and kind of just cleave through them. Luffy also has a defensive ability that comes up pretty often in Gum Gum Balloon. By inflating himself with air, Luffy's able to kind of bounce things off of himself or keep himself fairly protected. Now for a couple of my personal favorites. Gum Gum Fireworks has Luffy jumping up in the air, twisting himself up, and then unwinding as he springs his arms and legs out to chaotically attack a big group. Gum Gum UFO turns his legs into a propeller that allows him to float around in the air. And lastly, Water Luffy, which is just Luffy after he drank a bunch of water. As you can see, there's a lot of straightforward uses for the rubbery properties that the fruit gives, but at the same time, there's also some ingenuity that Luffy puts into these abilities. Some imagination would have had to go into some of these, or he would have never gotten as far as he has. Of course, things don't just stop there though, as he wasn't just limited to what he could think of himself. One of Luffy's biggest strengths has always been his ability to adapt and learn from his opponents. The first big example of this is obviously Gear 2nd, which could be considered the second zone form. Inspired by CP9's Rokushiki, more specifically Shave, Luffy gets the idea of upping the speed of his movements and attacks. By pumping the blood throughout his body faster than normal, Luffy turns red and begins to let out steam, amplifying his speed and strength. While originally he could only enter this form by using his legs to act as pumps, he later learns to activate it in more simple and efficient ways. Gear 2nd originally drained him so much that it could be a threat to his lifespan. However, with practice and after his 2 years of training, this seems to all be but a non-issue now. When active, Luffy is able to overcome CP9's Iron Body skills and at least injure any non-Logia opponent that he fought in the first half of the Grand Line. Even people like Blackbeard or Magellan, which makes this a pretty big jump in comparison to his base form, which was more or less useless even against CP9. The names of Luffy's attacks in this form tend to have jet in them, to demonstrate the boost in speed. For example, Gum Gum Pistol becomes Gum Gum Jet Pistol. And rather than a big startup from his normal form, Luffy can basically throw a normal punch, except it moves so fast that it becomes nearly invisible, with only the impact really being seen. When he first uses it against Bluno, Bluno makes a joke about having warning that the attack is coming. Bluno then uses Shave, and despite moving incredibly fast himself, Luffy is still able to land a punch that Bluno can't even react to. Post-time skip though, we see a bit of theme changing with Luffy's attack names, especially in Gear 2nd. While jet attacks still show up, we also add in the Hawk series. Basically, these are jet attacks with the addition of Hawky. For example, Gum Gum Red Hawk, which actually sees Luffy's attacks moving so fast that the friction against the air ignites the punch and it becomes a fiery dedication to his brother Ace. We also see attacks being named after other birds like eagles or rocks, but they're all essentially just Hawky-powered jet attacks. While these attack names might still be referencing to weapons like the Desert Eagle, this could have also been a reference to Luffy's fruit being a zone type this whole time. On to Gear 3rd, the level up which was definitely the most incomplete when it was first used. Luffy blows into his thumb and sends air into his bones, inflating them to gigantic proportions. While this is typically used to make his arms bigger, it can later be passed down to any part of him. And I do mean any, ladies. Okay, I'll stop. While he would originally inflate his entire arm, he can later send the air to his feet, or even just to his hands. By inflating individual parts of himself rather than full limbs, he can lessen the air resistance his attacks need to deal with, so most of his more quick Gear 3rd attacks will be isolated like this, while when he needs bigger force, the entire limb tends to be inflated. While insanely powerful, this originally came with the downside of shrinking Luffy to about half his size for a period. At first this lasted for a considerable amount of time, but as he practices it, it shortens pretty quickly, and post-time skip it doesn't seem to affect him at all. Something to mention here is that you can't just blow into your thumb to inflate your body. And while Luffy has always been creative, this is the first thing that I might really consider an imaginative power. I.e., Luffy thinking up something that would be cool and bending reality to fit that idea. Like, yeah, there's always been some wacky stuff, but it's more or less been able to be made sense of when you consider someone having Luffy's body. But this is different. Air just can't do what he's asking it to do. Again, this could be a reference to the Nika fruit, which is only limited by the user's imagination. Some of his attacks early on would be given the Giant name scheme, for example, Giant Pistol, Giant Axe, or Giant Whip, which are all functionally the same as their Gum Gum counterparts, just on a much larger scale. Where we start to see variation from those original forms is when Haki is implemented into these attacks. Here, much like the Gear 2nd Haki attacks, we get some animal naming. For example, Elephant Gun and Grizzly Magnum, essentially the Gear 3 versions of Pistol and Bazooka. A personal favorite of mine in this form is Thor Elephant Gun, which adds in an electrical element to the attack itself. Again, something to note is that this inclusion of fire and lightning that we've been seeing in Luffy's attacks is pretty strange. While fire can be believable with the friction explanation, lightning just doesn't make sense because rubber can't conduct electricity. So here would likely be yet another example of Luffy's imagination being brought into reality. Luffy's 4th, 5th, and 6th forms are all in his 4th gear. The first form, Bound Man, Luffy learned in Ruskaina, but was first seen in Dressrosa. Rather than blowing into his thumb, Luffy instead blows into his arm and again inflates himself. While he doesn't become as big as in 3rd gear, he definitely gets a lot more buff than normal. He's pretty top heavy though in Bound Man, and all 4 of his limbs are covered in armament Haki. Bound Man is unable to stop bouncing, and it can't stand in place. However, it can retract its limbs into its body for some really powerful abilities. This form focuses less on that slingshot effect that Luffy is famous for, and more on compression and release. Basically, just like how Luffy used to pull his arm back and launch them forward, he now pulls his arms inside of themselves, and when enough pressure is built up, they launch out. Similarly, he can do this with his legs, and if he does it in quick succession, he can kind of fly for a little bit. Some of the major downsides of this form is that the range is pretty significantly limited. On top of that, he can't keep the form up indefinitely, and it wears him out pretty badly. Originally, Luffy is unable to move after using Gear 4th. He also loses the ability to use Haki for about 10 minutes, and when he has to use it twice in a row after fighting Doflamingo, he is unconscious for the next 3 days. As is tradition with Luffy's forms though, the more he practices with it, the more these effects start to fade away. Though at least up to his fight with Kaido, he does still have some limitations on his use of these abilities. The bread and butter attack for Bound Man is Gomu Gomu no King Kong Gun, which is the attack that ultimately defeats Doflamingo. Later this is evolved in Wano, and he can actually project Haki from his fist so that he never has to make direct contact. And even so, without touching the object, it's strong enough to shatter a block of steel. In terms of involving imagination in this ability, all of Gear 4th in general is pretty beyond what rubber should be able to do. But what always stands out to me as being especially strange is Kong Organ, or Monkey King Murder of Crows Cannon in English, which just doesn't roll off the tongue the same way. This attack sees Luffy moving his arms from side to side so fast that it looks like he has 3 arms on each side, and each of them uses Kong Gun. Moving on to our 5th form though, we have Tank Man, which is something. This was only really used against Cracker on Whole Cake Island, and it has Luffy taking on a much more defensive Gear 4th that uses the quickly burning metabolism that Gear 4th causes in order to keep eating more and more of Cracker's biscuit soldiers. The form doesn't really offer much outside of appetite and defense, but there is a pretty substantial jump in both of those. Cracker was previously able to stab into Boundman, but as Tankman, his attacks are completely useless. So if Boundman is power and Tankman is durability, then Snakeman, form number 6, is all about speed. While Luffy's legs and arms are a little bit bigger, the rest of him stays fairly normal in size. On top of that, Haki doesn't seem to spread across the entire limb like it does with Boundman, and stops about 2/3 of the way through. Because of the lack of inflation in this form though, Luffy is much more vulnerable to damage in comparison to the other two. But that's not that big a problem when you consider just how fast this form is, and that in an emergency Luffy can always switch between forms. Luffy's attacks in Snakeman are much faster, and while they do deal less damage than Boundman might offer, it's much more concentrated, which can make up for it. The true utility of this form is Python. With this, Luffy can redirect his punches in mid-air and allow them to build up more and more speed and momentum, as well as adjust his attacks if they're dodged, basically turning his punches into honing attacks that do more damage the longer they're trying to hit the target. The Snakeman version of Gum Gum Pistol, which takes Python into account, is Culverin, or Great Serpent Cannon, and it's kind of his go-to in this form, although we do see a couple upgraded attacks as well. All of these forms take advantage of Luffy's imaginations in some way or another, turning his basic rubber abilities into things which are almost incomparable when placed next to each other. It's like showing someone a bike and they make you a car. The function of going from point A to point B is the same, but the ability, the form, and the capacity are just not even in the same league. And that leads us to Luffy's newest form, and his most powerful one by far, Gear 5. Gorosei explained that in this awakened state, the Nika Fruit's powers are only limited by Luffy's imagination, and he can effectively do anything. Something which we see being shown off as he moves and interacts with the world, kind of like a Looney Tune character. Luffy in his Sun God state gets what looks like flaming hair, but aside from that his form seems to be pretty similar to his basic form. He also seems to always be laughing and smiling, which is likely where the title of Joy Boy comes in. While we've only seen bits of this form so far, this form does seem to easily hold up with and overcome Kaido by breaking the laws of the world around them to fit Luffy's imagination. Turning the floor into rubber and bending it up to deflect Kaido's Boro breath, Luffy can enlarge his body and coil it around Kaido, and he can even swing Kaido around so fast that it looks like his eyes are popping out of his head. Basically, if a Looney Tune could do it, so can Luffy. Just as with every new form though, this will likely come at a pretty substantial cost, and if I had to guess, it could be pretty close to fatal. Gear 2 saw Luffy shortening his lifespan and becoming worn out with excessive use. Gear 3 shrunk his body and, after his last attack on Lucci, left him unable to move. Gear 4 leaves him unconscious, sometimes for several days, and if it keeps escalating, Gear 5 might cause something much more significant. But we'll have to wait and see. The idea of Luffy's fruit being a mythical zone, though, makes every aspect of his abilities feel totally different and, in some ways, much more understandable. The focus on different forms, something which we haven't really seen other Paramecia do very often, if at all, mixed in with this imaginative understanding of how rubber could be possibly used, definitely helps us paint a picture of how Luffy's attacks came into being. While some people might feel like the model Nika fruit came out of nowhere, I think it's the final piece of the puzzle that we needed to fully understand or get a grasp on Luffy's powers. But what do you guys think? Do you like the model Nika change, or do you hate it? Or maybe you just think we need more time to really see how it shakes out. As for Luffy's other forms, which one's your favorite? For me, I love Gear 4, but there's something always so cool about second gear. It's just so satisfying for me. That said though, if Gear 5 continues to be as amazing as it was in the first chapter there, it might be a pretty easy number 1 for me. Either way, let me know in the comments. Regardless, let me know what you guys think in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, remember to leave a like. It really does help with the YouTube algorithm, as well as helping us to focus in on the content that you want to see. And be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss any of the other great videos coming your way. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at AnimeUproar, or if you're looking for more of me, you can find me over on my own channel, AxelBeats. Thank you guys so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, remember to stay excellent.